All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Mindgasms. So, I am Andrew, aka Damon Mindgasms, for the purposes of this video, and I'm going to talk about the new House of the Dragon show. Of course, based on the book called Fire and Blood by George R.R. Martin, which is a prequel to his Song of Ice and Fire series, on which the famous Game of Thrones fantasy series is based. And I'm going to talk about the first episode of House of the Dragon, whether it's actually good, and whether it can possibly redeem the mangled Game of Thrones ending. So I'm going to go about this by commenting on my buddy Dusty's video from his woke centrist channel, of course, with his little spoiler-free short video on it, because we were going to do a podcast about this, but it didn't end up working out because of me and my fucked up schedule. So, as a bit of a substitute, I'm going to comment on his video, and hopefully for future episodes, he and I, and perhaps also Chris, because he was going to perhaps join us to discuss it too, will talk about episodes 2 and on. So let's get into this here.
Hello, everybody. It is your favorite friendly neighborhood woke centrist here. I just want to give you guys a quick first impressions on the first episode of House of the Dragon. I'm not going to get into spoilers or anything too deep here. I just had
I'm going to expand on what Dusty's saying and get into spoilers.
watched it recently, and it's possible me and Mindgasms might get into a more in-depth conversation about this show, or at least this first episode. But I just wanted to give you guys my spoiler-free first impressions. So, production looks pretty good. I'll have to say, costuming is awesome. The source material that they pull from, they're doing a great job here.
Yeah, that's a Fire and Blood book. Yeah, I agree. The costumes are good too. Like as much of the authentic kind of medieval fantasy feel as they were in the Game of Thrones series, I would say. And yeah, Fire and Blood is I honestly, it's been a while since I've read Fire and Blood, so I think I might reread it before do my next review of future episodes of it. But it's basically, if I remember correctly, it's kind of like a history of basically the Targaryens they when they ruled King's Landing, and it was an endless succession of Targaryens who sat on the Iron Thrones, and that's where we see that it was a regular thing for the Targaryens to be dragon riders and controlling dragons. It's only the show's Dusty's about to say this, but the show's set 170 years before Daenerys Targaryen existed in the events of the Game of Thrones show and the Song of Ice and Fire books. So it's perhaps because of this time in history and how poor they are at keeping proper records, and how it affects how fast truth becomes myth, basically. And that's why at the beginning of the Game of Thrones show and Song of Ice and Fire books, it's basically kind of more grimdark anti-fantasy, and people think everything to do with magic is just crazy nonsense and a myth, like we do in the real world for the most part, right? And then it becomes more and more like actual fantasy when we discover that all of these myths about magic, or most of them anyway, turned out to be true. Like we know that and in Fire and Blood, for example, and House of the Dragon, we know that it was a regular thing for a long period of history for Targaryens to be riding dragons. And we know in the Game of Thrones show, of course, that witches like the Red Woman existed, and she actually has magical powers and can resurrect people and whatnot. And there's all sorts of other magic happening. And of course, the White Walkers that are like zombies, and you have to use these special obsidian or dragon glass blades to be able to kill them, which is awesome because it mixes fantasy with zombies. But yeah, that's a big thing about the Targaryens, that there was a long history of them riding dragons. Dragons were totally not a myth at all, and people used to just accept them as part of the Targaryen house.
acting is pretty good. When you hear people talk about dollar store Legolas, you'll pretty much know what they mean within like the first 20 minutes of the show. So this is something that me and my significant other were looking very much forward to. So one thing I did
I
know,
don't, I've, I don't know if he's talking. I think he might be talking about Daemon Targaryen there because he kind of looks like Legolas. I think I don't watch Doctor Who, but I think he was the last guy who played the last most recent Doctor Who, or maybe one of the last two most recent ones. And he's obviously the antagonist of the show. He's the main villain. He's obviously throughout the first episode being set up for this whole civil war because as Dusty and Tristram and I were talking about before with trailers for the House of the Dragon, it seems like it's obvious that they're going to set up basically this civil war in House Targaryen, and you can see that it's going to be between Rhaenyra, who's the woman and the princess and the daughter of the king, who is the Targaryen who's ruling King's Landing at the start of this first episode, and he has to pick an heir, and his wife never gives birth to a male son. So at the end of the episode, he makes his daughter Rhaenyra the next heir to the Iron Throne because he doesn't want his brother Daemon to be the next king, and everyone else in his council wants that too, and he doesn't want. No one wants that to happen because he's so fucking violent and impulsive and unpredictable. As we see how I think it's the very first time we see his character, if I'm not mistaken, but it could be it's at least very close to the beginning of the show. He goes and slaughters a whole bunch of people in his new position of powers. So he's got this incredible bloodlust, and he'll just be like an insatiable butcher king who is terrible at actual governing, basically. So it's clearly going to set up this civil war in the Targaryens between Rhaenyra and Daemon, and Daemon's obviously Rhaenyra's uncle, so there are going to be conflicts with that, with families going against each other. So these sorts of things we saw in Game of Thrones all the time, right? The struggle for the power of the Iron Throne, how power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely because it's all everyone wants, and there's an endless succession of kings, and we have families pitted against each other for power and betraying each other for power. I'm sure there's going to be all kinds of stuff like that in the show too.
notice, um, and I'm talking about differences between this show and the Game of Thrones. I know it's not family viewing,
Well,
that's for
hell not.
sure.
Yeah.
But in
Yeah, like it's super fucking bloody, and of course in the first episode there's lots of blood and violence, and there's mass butchery, and there's that big jousting tournament that ends very violently, and then there's that violent medieval C-section that ends up with with the wife dying in childbirth, and the child who we find out is finally a son dying shortly after birth. And of course, Damon goes to a whorehouse and he's fucking a hooker. So there's, of course, the sex, nudity, and blood and violence and brutality that is customary for Game of Thrones.
this opening episode, there is a significant amount of gore that I was not expecting. Um, I did not consider Game of Thrones. It wasn't that much of a gory show, even during the fighting scenes. But there were a lot of uncomfortable violence, and it's not
Yeah, there's a lot of violence and rape. I feel like it was bloody, but it wasn't like gory, and perhaps the House of Dragons show is more noticeably gory right off the bat. I think you could say that, but I'm not really sure, and I think the difference is subtle if there is one, but I can see that point.
uncomfortable for me per se, but
Oh
I
yeah, and of course,
really
like the worst aspects of the show in terms of violence were all the fucking graphic rape scenes, and you know one part that really bothered me was seeing that child be burned alive when I forget which king it was, but the one who the red woman was originally with, was it Stannis? I think it was, yeah, I think it was Stannis Baratheon, perhaps, uh, or I don't remember for sure, but it was it it was his daughter who he agreed to burn alive at the stake, and then it showed that that part was fucking even disturbing even for me in the show. The Game of Thrones show gets so fucking disturbing that it turns even me off sometimes, and I have a high tolerance for that sort of shit. But yeah, the first episode is pretty brutal and violent, and there's sex, but luckily there's no rape. I mean, that's bound to happen in House of the Dragon, I'm sure, at various points, but that's like the type of violence that bothers me too.
We wanted to make sure that my significant other, she's a little bit squeamish when it comes to those types of things. So um, I was getting a little bit nervous that she wouldn't want to watch the show because she doesn't really like excessive violence, we're showing, limbs getting chopped off and stuff like that.
Yeah, it was pretty gratuitous violence, like people getting chopped into all kinds of pieces and stuff when Damon and his soldiers are slaughtering all those people. That's probably the most gory part of the show, if not maybe the fucking botched C-section that they do on the pregnant woman is perhaps even more gory and disturbing than that, debatably.
That um, and that wasn't even the most excessive part. I don't think there is a scene. I'm not going to describe it too much. That has nothing to do with violence at all. That is quite bloody and gory. I thought they lingered a bit too
Yeah, I
much with
think that's almost certainly what Dusty's talking about here, the fucking botched C-section in medieval times that led to a fucking violent, bloody and gory death of the mother and the child dying soon after that.
on some of the things we would consider gross. But anyway, yeah, lots more violence. I remember the first episode of Game of Thrones, and I don't remember it being as violent as this episode.
Maybe they wanted to, the creators of the Game of Thrones show wanted to ease you into the violence more because grimdark fantasy had never been seen on TV or movies before, if I remember correctly. And because this is a prequel show, but Game of Thrones has already happened, they know that people are aware of Game of Thrones, so they're just going to go right into all the stuff that people expect from Game of Thrones, all the brutal violence and sex and nudity and all that stuff. Just go straight into it rather than easing people into it. I could see that maybe that's the reason why they did that.
Um, One of the things we do have is the episode ends. It seems that it ends causing the primary conflict of the series, and there's a lot
Yeah,
of entangled web of political machinations that you can see.
yeah, you can see it's going to be the civil war between the Targaryens, between Rhaenyra when she becomes queen, and Daemon. And you can see this aspect. This aspect too is interesting in terms of comparisons between House of the Dragon and Game of Thrones. And what I was talking about earlier in terms of the dragons, how especially at the start of Game of Thrones, uh, dragons are seen as a thing of myth and all different types of magic, but then we it becomes more and more of a fantasy show as we find out that there actually are dragons and there actually is magic and the red woman can resurrect people, and we see in the Fire and Blood book that there was a long history of Targaryens being dragon riders and just having dragons all the time in the you could say that similarly for this here. Oh shit, I just lost my train of thought.
See that go on in the show. Entangled
Oh, right,
web
right.
of
The Civil War. So yeah, the Civil War between in the Targaryens, between Rhaenyra and Daemon. we see that this is a standard thing that happens in Game of. Oh, right. That's the train of thought that I just lost. We see that in Game of Thrones, people are skeptical of Daenerys Targaryen wanting to sit on the Iron Throne because there has never been a female. That they say, if I remember correctly, that there's never been a female Targaryen who has sat on the Iron Throne and been Queen of the Seven Kingdoms. But we know when we go back to the history in House of the Dragon here that that was a myth in the same way that it was false that there were never dragons before, because in the same way that it was a regular thing for a very long period of time for all Targaryens to be dragon riders and everyone across the world to know that dragons were a real thing. Back then, they were telling Rhaenyra that there had never been a female Targaryen sitting on the Iron Throne, and there had never been a queen before. So, in the same way that people like people have amnesia about history and they forget things so quickly. In the plot of the Game of Thrones, people have forgotten that dragons 170 years ago, that's the only gap between these two shows and the books, that in the same way that it was a regular thing for there to be dragons and people forgot about it and thought that dragons were a myth and had never existed, people in Game of Thrones thought that there had never been a female Queen Targaryen who was sitting on the Iron Throne, even though there actually was one 170 years in the past. So they forgot that dragons existed, and they forgot that there actually had been a Queen Targaryen before as well.
Political machinations that you can see that go on in the show. One of the things, it's all predating the Game of Thrones series by about 175 years. So none of the characters there are going to be recognizable. One of my gripes, though, and this has nothing to do with the show per se, it's mainly concerning the original material. I have a really hard time remembering the Targaryen names. Like, they are so similar
Yeah, they are.
that it's really hard to remember who's who and what
Yeah, the only names that I remember from the first episode so far are Rhaenyra and Daemon, because they seem like they're obviously being set up as the main protagonist and antagonist. And I bet, as happened in Game of Thrones, everyone's going to become more morally gray, and the evil people stay pretty much evil, but occasionally do good things, and the good people become more corrupted and are okay with doing more morally bad things if it's to if it's to bring them closer toward fulfilling their ultimate goal, which is a larger moral good, basically.
their names are. Um, there are characters with very similar names, and they're not the easiest names to pronounce when you see what they look like in writing.
Yeah.
So, did I enjoy what I watched? I thought it was pretty good. The very first episode, lots of violence. You do get a sex scene. I'm less concerned about the sex scenes than I am about the violence. It's for me. It's just, can I watch this with my significant other, or she'd be too squeamish?
Yeah. I think Dusty's not squeamish about that stuff at all, but his wife is. And yeah, I agree too. I think the show so far is pretty good. I like it. I'm looking forward to future episodes. And oh yeah, as far as the other part of this title too, I think it is actually good, but I think it's too early to tell whether it can redeem the notoriously mangled ending of the Game of Thrones show. So far, I am pleasantly surprised. It would be fucking awful if they made a terrible prequel just as a money grab after mangling the ending. But it seems like maybe they understand from fans and they actually appreciated that feedback and adapted to it, about how mangled the ending got, and maybe because of that, hopefully they'll do a better ending or a way better job with the ending of the series this time, hopefully.
Um, But she soldiered through it. She was able to get through the first episode, and I think for now we're interested in continuing on and seeing how this unfolds. But yeah, this is just a quick, hot first impression of the show. I thought it was pretty decent. I know they have a high bar to clear. One of the things I will note though is it seems like the dragon budget wasn't as high as the original Game of Thrones. You could definitely see that they cut some corners when it comes to the CGI regarding the dragons.
Yeah, saw and heard other people say that too. I didn't actually notice that as much. Apparently, a lot of people were complaining and they thought that the CGI for the dragons was just terrible. But to me, I mean, I did only relatively recently actually watch the show because it had been a long time before I finished it until recently. But I think the CGI wasn't really that great on the Game of Thrones show either, really. Like it's hard to have good CGI for dragons, really. Like they looked fake on the show. I'm not really sure that they look that much more fake on House of the Dragon, but I mean, maybe they do. Maybe I just didn't notice to the same extent as other people.
Um, I don't know what it is. It just to me doesn't look as good. I know probably throughout the series they're going to have to cut corners because the dragons are going to be a much more prominent aspect of this series in comparison to Game of Thrones. And I know
Yeah, definitely, because they're an accepted creature that exists in the in Westeros during this time period, rather than just being a myth that people don't believe actually exists at all during the Game of Thrones period of time in Westeros, right?
from what I from what I know that the dragon scenes were particularly expensive. And if they're going to load up on these dragons for this series, it seems that they might cut a little bit of corners. You could definitely tell that the CGI isn't as good, in my opinion, as the original Game of Thrones. But we'll see. And you know what? I don't mind too much. It's to me, CGI is going to look like CGI, whether I like it or not. But it wasn't too distracting. But anyway, that is my quick synopsis and my quick first impression of the show. I'll probably will let you guys know if me and Andrew do more fully, um, like a more deeper analysis into this first episode, as opposed to doing a spoiler free analysis. And there's a bunch of stuff in here. You know, there's in this episode there's drama, there's violence, there's sex. It's like they check off like all of the major checkpoints in this.
All of the Game of Thrones boxes.
You know, it's an HBO show. You know, there has to be some, and it's a pretty big sex scene, so you'll see it's in the first.
Oh, also too, I forgot to mention, a lot of other people have been mentioning this. The fairly recently, season 4 of Game of Thrones broke records as the most popular streaming show ever on any streaming service in the English language. So it's the most popular show ever, other than Squid Game, which obviously was in Korean. So House of the Dragon broke Stranger Things 4's record and is now the most popular English language uh, streaming show of all time by far. It beat the shit out of Stranger Things 4's record. So that's good news too, because there was such notorious widespread disappointment in the ending of Game of Thrones. Yet so many people were willing to watch this that it broke records again for the most popular English language streaming show on any streaming service ever so far. So that's pretty awesome too.
First episode. But anyway, guys, thank you for taking the time to check this out. If you have any things that you have in first impressions of, please put it in the comments. Like and subscribe. We'll really look forward to hearing your guys' feedback. All right. Well, thank you guys very much. Like and share this content. Click on the bell to make sure that you're notified whenever I drop a video. And you'll hear from me soon when we talk about. We're actually planning on doing a video on the second half of the OCD project, as well as doing a little bit of deeper dive into this first episode of the House of Dragon. So, anyway, you guys have a great day today. Check it out. Take it easy.
All right. All right, thanks everyone for watching. I wanted to talk about my buddy's Dusty's video for this and kind of respond to that and expand on it and get into spoilers a bit. So yeah, hopefully we'll do a deeper dive discussion with Dusty and I and perhaps Chris as well on episode 2 and future episodes for each individual episode ideally, or perhaps several at once, who knows. So yeah, check that video out on Dusty's channel, Woke Centrist. And yeah, thanks everyone for watching. Share this everywhere. Click that like button, subscribe to the channel, click that bell to be notified when I come out with new videos. Check out my last one I just did a few minutes ago on the final trailer for the upcoming Lord of the Rings Rings of Power series on Amazon Prime that's going to be coming out in a couple days or so. And yeah, check out I think my next video, I think I'm probably going to do one on the book by George R.R. Martin, the how House of Dragon / Fire and Blood, and also Game of Thrones / A Song of Ice and Fire author's vampire book that he wrote in the 80s, which was really good and I read recently. So I'm probably going to do a video about that for my next one, and check out podcasts on the second episode of House of the Dragon recently came out. So we're probably going to do a podcast on that soon, and also perhaps sometime soon that movie chat we've been meaning to do for a while on Reversing Roe, which is a documentary about the decades-long process of evangelical Christian groups like the so-called moral majority pressuring Republicans to do an endless series of legislation that gradually led to Roe versus Wade being overturned recently in the US, which basically made it up to the states as to whether they make abortion legal or illegal rather. So check that out too. And yeah, like I always say, I love you all. Keep being the time beam of light that shines through the almost impenetrable darkness in the universe. And most importantly, always remember this: the funk cures all, and groove is in the heart. Oh yeah, and also check out my Patreon page. The link is in the description of the video as always. And if you give me $10 a month, then you can vote on future topics, books, and movies that I will discuss both by myself and with others. But any amount other than that is great. And yeah, also comment on the video. Let me know what you think of first episode of House of the Dragon and how it's going so far. And go and comment on Dusty's video and let me know what you think about his takes here and on his channel as well. And subscribe to his channel too. All right, thanks again, everyone, and adios until next time.